Hey everyone, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio Show on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm Aaron Freeman over at FalFans.com. I'm joined by my partner and co-host Scott Karasik at Sportsnot. We are back after a little bit of a break to catch you guys up on some of the OTA headlines of the last couple of weeks. We will talk about Dwight Freeney visiting the Falcons last week. We will talk about two roster moves that they made earlier today, some low-level roster decisions. And, of course, we'll answer you guys' mailbag questions throughout the show and at the end of the show as well. So, Scott, we've been off. We were off last week, and, there's been some minor stuff going on in Falcons OTAs. It's OTAs, so you can't really get too excited about anything that's happening. But are there any things that you're hearing from these last week or two that sort of jump out to you as, that's interesting. That's something to keep my eye on as things progress this summer. A couple of topics maybe that you might like. What do you think of maybe Philip Wheeler getting a lot of the first team strong side linebacker work? What do you think about Akeem King being the nickel? What do you think about Brooks Reed playing defensive end, Ricardo Allen bulking up, et cetera, et cetera? Anything sort of stand out to you?
Out of all of them, the one thing that's really stood out to me is they're using Hardy as the main number 3. I would have thought I know we all were thinking, Hardy's a good fit, but I think Hardy as the main number 3 while playing, from what I've been hearing, mainly outside as opposed to slot, because they've been trying to work Julio Jones more in the slot.
Okay.
So I think the fact that they're trying to put Julio in the slot and pretty much give the middle finger to any team that they face this year is a good idea.
So is the big thing you're taking away that Hardy's the number 3 receiver, or is that he's playing mostly on the outside?
That he's playing mostly on the outside where he played in college and where he probably feels a little more comfortable. And because they want to use Julio in the slot a little bit more.
Okay. Fine. For me, I'm glad to hear that Ricardo Allen's bulked up because he definitely needed to. I hope it, he's up to about 197 pounds. That puts him at about low-level free safety, like the smaller free safeties in the league are like 5'9", 195. I think like that's about what like Jarris Byrd is, and I think Earl Thomas is maybe like 5'10", 200 or something like that. So that's like the minimum, basically, what I'm saying for what you want in a free safety in the NFL. So it's good to hear that Ricardo Allen has done that, and I hope it makes a difference with his tackling this year. That became a little bit more problematic in the second half of last season, sort of his ability in run support. The good thing is, adding Keanu Neal should hopefully take a little bit of pressure off of him to have to make those stops in the open field. But if he can improve there, then I think that will certainly help solidify what could be the strength of the Falcons' defense this year, which is their secondary, at least as far as the starting lineup goes. So, that's something one of the early OTA headlines that I'm excited, at least, as much as you can be in OTAs to hear.
I mean, the other option that you could really look at, they've been using Brooks Reed as an end, yeah. I think Reed as the Leo in the base has also been going down, which makes sense when you look at what the Leo basically does, and the fact that he's played both 3-4 outside linebacker and 4-3 defensive end during his time in the NFL. He's played more defensive end in pass rush sets, but I mean, it's still been a defensive end role. Helps out with Reed a lot. And I do like him as that Leo's fit. If you're going to put like Shelby as the strong side end, or Upshaw as the strong side end, or Hageman as the strong side end, the only real question in the base then becomes who's playing nose tackle. And if they really like Joey Embu as much as it seems, that's another thing to take away. They like Joey Embu. So if they really like Joey Embu as much as it seems, then maybe Brooks Reed out on the end isn't as bad as we think.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm taking a wait and see approach with Brooks Reed at defensive end. Honestly, at this point, I kind of think they're doing it because they don't really have a spot for him on the team, but because they paid him all that money last offseason, they're kind of forced to play him at another spot. It's to me, like they're playing Philip Wheeler at the Sam linebacker spot a lot through these OTAs. Obviously, Beasley's getting some more work there. And if Reed is if they're looking at Beasley as the long-term strong side linebacker and Wheeler as a capable short-term guy for the time being, then Brooks Reed is kind of on the outside looking in terms of what role he's going to have to be. And him playing some defensive end, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think he can be decent there, but I'm not really expecting him at this point to be a major contributor this year if he's going to be stuck with his hand in the dirt more often than not. It's just I don't think that's really where his best fit is. But like he can get by there, and maybe he give us decent snaps there in a rotation. So if he does succeed there, then great. If he doesn't, then I think it's just kind of the Falcons, doing their best to make lemonade out of lemons.
I mean, yeah, probably. But I think he could be like a 3-sack guy with solid run defense, which he'll be better than Croy Bierman as a pass rusher.
I would disagree, but again, I probably have a higher opinion on Croy Bierman than it seems like the rest of the world does. But
as a pass rusher, Croy Bierman is probably the worst pass rusher in the NFL.
I think there's probably at least like 7 pass rushers on the Falcons roster today that are worse than Croy Bierman, so I don't quite agree with that. But okay. You have anything else to add about the OTAs, or do you want to talk a little bit more about Freeney?
I mean, OTAs are OTAs. I hate to say it this way, like they don't really matter. They're just kind of there.
Yeah, that's a pretty good take on it.
I mean, it's just seeing how guys are feeling comfortable with their new teammates. You kind of get that first bit of familiarity. You get a kind of idea of what the Falcons are going to try and do as far as guys that they might think about moving, which is what OTAs is all about, trying a guy out, seeing if it works for a little bit, going back, seeing how he takes to it. I do like how they're having competition at certain spots, like the entire front 7. I don't think there's a single spot in that front 7 that's locked in.
This seems pretty accurate, yeah.
And I think,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was saying, I think in the secondary, that's like that secondary is locked in for the top 4 guys: Trufant, Neal, Allen, and Alford. But past them, it's just a total clusterfuck of competition.
Yeah.
Everybody else is competing for spots on the roster.
Yeah, yeah, that's a pretty accurate statement. Yeah, I mean, like the thing about OTAs is some stuff that happens in OTAs matters and some stuff doesn't, but it's hard to sort of discern what it is because basically, if a guy looks good in OTAs, he has to continue it in training camp, or it really is pointless. No one makes a team in May. So it's one of those things where like some guys will look good in OTAs and they'll carry that over in the training camp. And you're like, oh, okay, so that guy's, all the headlines and quotes we were reading about that guy doing well in OTAs meant something. But then there's plenty of guys that, look good in shorts and shells in the spring and summer. And then once we get to training camp, disappear. So then it's kind of like, okay, that didn't really mean much. So, I'm one of those people that's like, okay, OTA stuff is interesting, but I'm not going to, read too much into it until we get to training camp that's when, the quote unquote real bullets start to fly. So, yeah. Okay, Scott, let's talk about Dwight Freeney's visit last week. He visited last Wednesday, met with the team, did not get a contract, led to some people, some crazy people online overreacting to it. But afterwards, he came out, had an interview with SiriusXM, and some of the quotes that he said in that interview, at least some of the quotes they tweeted out, were Freeney basically saying he's a 95% chance that he's going to play this season. He planned on visiting both Atlanta and Cincinnati and leaving without a contract. The Falcons were likely to be his last stop, and he called it a good visit. And he's still hoping that he gets an offer from Arizona before training camp happens. So anything that you to follow up on Freeney not being a Falcon or whatever you want to talk about this?
I mean, when you look at what the Falcons did this offseason, they kind of went out there with a more coherent plan than people want to admit. They basically said, hey, we're going to flip Tyson Jackson and Rashid Hageman, see if it works. If it doesn't work, we'll flip them back. We know they can work in the spots that they were in. We're going to see how Babineau, Jarrett, Shelby all do in the pass rush set. We're going to see how Claiborne and Beasley do in the pass rush set. Where does that leave a spot for Dwight Freeney? Obviously, the Falcons like Adrian Claiborne a little bit more than we do, like you and I do. But I like Freeney. I think they should bring him in straight for just, hey, it's 3rd and 10, jump on the field, it's your job. But I don't know past that what his role would be. And even then, I'd be more than willing to sign him for $3 million, $4 million and throw him on the field and just put him out there and say, hey, go get after the quarterback and take the 6 sacks he'll give you in that role. I mean, that's all he can do right now. He's a one-trick pony. He can't play against the run at all, but hell, if you got Dwight Freeney on the field, you don't need him to do anything but rush the passer. And having him here to teach, Vic Beasley and Adrian Claiborne and, Derek Shelby and a couple of these other guys how to pass rush even better wouldn't hurt, especially since he could help Vic kind of tighten up that spin move that he was having issues with.
Yeah. No, I think you hit some points there that I agree with for the most part. I think, Freeney's going to be a 20, 25 snap guy. That's what he was in Arizona. That's all he's going to be at this point. But I think that has value, particularly if the alternative you have, if that means now Adrian Claiborne, instead of playing 40 snaps, he only plays 15. I think that, makes him much more effective. I think if that means Brooks Reed now has, plays 10 less snaps or something like that as a defensive end, then that makes him a little bit more effective and so on and so forth. I do think you're right. Freeney could help Beasley develop that spin move a little bit more because obviously Freeney has perfected that spin move. That spin move will get him into the Hall of Fame, and they will have a nice little video screen, I guess. I'm assuming at his section of the Hall of Fame, just showing off that spin move.
I perfected the dip. Dip end under a left tackle. No one did it better than Abraham.
Yeah. So I feel like getting Freeney would have been a big move for the Falcons, particularly since the only real investment they did this offseason in their pass rush was signing Derek Shelby, which is not small potatoes, but it isn't exactly, you're just adding a guy who had 3.5 sacks last year. So it's not as if you're like suddenly revamping your pass rush. So getting another guy like Freeney and having a little bit more options on passing downs this year, particularly off the edge, I think would be beneficial for the team. It does sound like, Freeney is going to basically sit out OTAs with any team. I think he's kind of just waiting around. I think he's really actually waiting for Arizona to offer a contract, but because Arizona got Chandler Jones and has a bunch of other young guys like Okafor and Marcus Golden, they're not really in any rush to really bring him back. So I think Freeney's basically going to wait around, see what happens in training camp. If Cincinnati and Atlanta are still wanting to make a move at that point, then he'll probably decide between one of those two teams. I would probably guess that Atlanta would be his third choice among Arizona, Cincinnati, just because, there's a lot less. No offense to the Falcons. I'm not trying to knock the Falcons, but Cincinnati, Arizona are obviously coming off of playoff seasons, and they probably have a little bit more talent on their defensive lines right now. If you're a Freeney, that you can sort of play. I'd rather play beside Geno Atkins than whoever the Falcons are throwing out there. So
Grady Jarrett.
Yeah, no offense to Grady Jarrett. Love Grady Jarrett, but Geno Atkins is Geno Atkins.
I mean, so instead of playing next to Grady Jarrett, Jonathan Babineau, and Vic Beasley, which it's the best that the Falcons have had in a while, but it's not anywhere close to Geno Atkins, Michael Johnson, Carlos Dunlap, DeMonte Pico, Marcus Hunt, those guys that they got over there.
Yeah. So we got a mailbag question. Charlie Rogers 68 asked, does Freedy want too much money or is he in love with Arizona? Now, I think the answer is he's kind of in love with Arizona. But if I had to choose between one of these two options, I don't think the money is really an issue because I think last year he played for like $1.6 million or something like that. So I wouldn't expect him to be like going out there asking for like $5 or $6 million at this point. So, but Scott,
you played on a veteran minimum deal.
I think he got like 800,000. I saw somewhere where he was like for like every.
Yeah, he got
off incentives.
Yeah, for each sack he got an extra. For 4 sacks he got 200,000. Each additional one, he got an extra 100,000. So he wound up making it was 970 plus. So 970 plus 200 plus 400, yeah, 1570. So $1.57 million what he made last year. He only counted $412K towards the cap. So Atlanta would probably try and structure something similarly. He might even be waiting till after the beginning of the season, just because people are worried about vested veteran status. Guy's 36 years old. What happens if he gets injured? So.
Fair enough. Okay. Any other thoughts on Dwight Freeney before we move on?
No.
Okay.
That's all I got for him.
All right. Now the real meat of the show, because I know you guys were waiting on bated breath for us to talk about the two guys that the Falcons picked up today. Nordley Cappy and Michael Huey. Cappy is a undrafted free agent last year with the Jaguars, continuing the Falcons streak of picking up guys that the Jaguars had in training camp in the last couple of years. And Michael Huey was an undrafted free agent out of Texas back in 2011, spent about 3 years playing in the Arena Football League and was with the Chargers practice squad last year and the Redskins practice squad the year before that. I actually went back and looked at my old 2011 draft notes because I scouted apparently everybody that year, and I actually found some notes on Michael Huey. And I was like, oh, I gave him like a 4th-round grade. Obviously, that didn't turn out particularly too well, but considering some of the offensive linemen I would take in the 4th round that year, I don't feel like I was crazy for thinking that highly of him. In those notes, I remember writing that he's probably a best fit in a zone blocking scheme. I think he was, I think it was like 315, 320 at Texas. He wasn't a particularly powerful guy, but I thought he was effective given his size and not having ideal athleticism. Basically, your classic sort of zone blocking guard. So I think he's a pretty good fit in Atlanta if he can, live up to that ability.
I remember him being really quick, and I remember him being semi-effective, but I just don't remember him being like jumping off the screen.
Yeah.
Like, this guy's amazing. I remember him being like, hey, it's just another guy. I think best case scenario, the Falcons get a solid depth guy out of him.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where the Falcons pretty much, I think other than Mike Person, they probably have like 1 or 2 backup interior lineman spots open. And I think he can compete for one of those jobs with guys like Schweitzer and James Stone and Ben Garland. He could be in the mix and he could wind up winning one of those jobs. I probably wouldn't put money on it, but it wouldn't be crazy to me to think that Michael Huey could be like the 8th or 9th guy in our offensive line rotation this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more likely that Schweitzer and Person, like Schweitzer and Person, and I think Harris are probably guaranteed spots. So you're really just kind of trying to find that last guy. I know you're not a huge fan of Schweitzer, but I think they drafted him because they know what they wanted from that spot.
I don't dislike Schweitzer. I wouldn't. I think he's probably a front runner for one of those reserve spots just because his draft status gives him a boost. But yeah, I wouldn't sit here and say that he's a lock. Like I'm pretty confident that if he doesn't make the roster, he'll be on the practice squad. But it is one of those things, and I'd probably not pick Harris as the other lock. I'd probably pick Tom Compton over Harris, but probably, yeah.
Which is fair. I mean, Compton.
They're about the same.
Left and right tackle.
They're about the same player. So, like the only reason I give Compton the edge is because of that experience from playing in Washington under Shanahan and Chris Morgan directly, as opposed to Harris, who was his only real experience playing with that coaching staff was last year.
Yeah. I don't know if James Stone makes the roster.
It doesn't seem likely. That's what I would say at this point.
I don't think he makes the roster. I don't think Huey makes the roster. I think the last four guys at offensive line are going to end up being Harris, Compton, Person, and Schweitzer. But ideally, someone comes in and just blows it away, and you're like, okay, well, this guy should start at like right guard, and then Chester's a backup. Or this guy should start at left guard, and then Levitri gets cut.
Okay. I think those are long shots. I think both of those guys are pretty much locked in being starters, assuming they're healthy. The one guy who I do think could, the four guys that you picked, I think are the guys I picked earlier in May to make the team when I did my 53-man roster projection after the draft. So I think those four guys are the likeliest guys to fill four of those backup spots. The one guy who I'll say people shouldn't sleep on is Ben Garland. I think he's a guy that could certainly unseat one of those spots and win a backup job. And I'd probably put Garland over Stone at this point. So, yeah.
High praise.
Yeah, I'm the last person in the world that actually, doesn't mind James Stone.
You're the last stoner.
There you go. The other guy we signed, Nordley Cappy, his nickname is Cap, because no one ever would go by the name Nordley if that was your first name. He was a guy they signed, and I actually did go back because I was bored and watching tape, and I was bored of watching Wes Schweitzer. So I was like, let me go back and watch Cappy in the first preseason game against the Steelers where, based off of Pro Football Focus metrics, he had like 2 sacks and 6 pressures. And, I watched him and I was like, okay, he's decent. Like, I think he's like listed at like 249 or something like that. And he plays like a 249-pound defensive end. He gets pushed around quite a bit, at least from the backup Steeler lineman in that preseason game. But he's got some quickness off the ball, and he was able to get some pressure because of his speed off the edge and beating both the left and right tackles. I think Ali Villanueva might have been one of those tackles he was beating. And, he's a high-energy guy, high-motor guy. So he's a guy that, because the Falcons don't really have a lot of, I guess, I don't even know what to call them. Basically, when you're looking at the defensive line, there's like 9 guys that are like, yeah, those guys are probably going to make the team. And then there's everybody else is just kind of a can't body at this point. Maybe Cappy could shock us a little bit and maybe throw his name in the wrench to at least make things interesting when cuts happen. I wouldn't pick him to make the roster, but he could certainly be on our radar when we're talking about filling out that practice squad if he can do some things like he did last summer with the Jaguars, this summer with the Falcons.
I mean, I see a bad football player that we're trying to church up.
Okay.
As bad as that sounds, like that's what I see. I mean, Cappy's a bad football player we're trying to church up. Huey's a bad football player we're trying to church up.
Okay.
Only reason why I like Huey is I think he's better than James Stone.
All right. So there you go, guys. There's your Michael Huey and Norley Cappy takes. So let's get to these mailbag questions. All right. First one, directed at you, Scott. Andrew Shawwaller asks, why does Scott not get credentials for Up at the Flowery Branch?
Because you have to request them, and because I don't have time to take off my day job and go up there. Because it takes me like an hour and a half to get up there anyway. So I basically waste half the day driving there and back to hear canned responses from the team. I hate to say it, whenever the team gives a response or any of that, it's just not worth it. I feel like I get more accurate information from agents than I would get from the team. So I'm not too worried about it.
Okay.
I don't even apply for them, so that's why I'm not worried about getting them.
There you go. All right, Andrew. I hope that answered your question. All right, the next question comes from the Colorado Falcon. He says, I guess this one is directed at me. I enjoy both Falcon Central Radio and the Falcon Fans podcast. Will you consider putting it on YouTube? I would subscribe. Well, obviously, this podcast, the Falcon Central Radio and the Pro Football Central Radio Network, is on YouTube. So I hope you are subscribing to it. As for the Falcon Fans podcast, I don't know. I've thought about putting it on YouTube, but putting an hour and a half of audio on YouTube is kind of at least for me, just kind of a waste of time. If you just want to listen to the podcast, there's better avenues for you to do that, at any of the 1,000 places that you can download a podcast, as opposed to listening to one on YouTube while you have nothing visually stimulating. So that's why that's not on YouTube. So I hope that answers your question, Colorado. Okay. Oh, Cookie Wallace at the Scorned One says, how do you see the secondary shaping up?
I mean, you're going to have Trufant and Alford. And you're going to have Allen and Neal. The same that it's always been from the rip. The only thing that I'd be worried about is the nickel. And worst case scenario, you start Akeem King at the nickel, and then Collins comes back, and you take Alford, you move him from here, put him in the slot, and then boom, Alford's back. Or Collins is back on the edge. Literally the only thing I'd change.
Okay. We got another question about Akeem King, so I'll save my Akeem King take for that question. But yeah, I think the question with the secondary is depth, not really who the starters are going to be. We kind of know who that is going to be. It's going to be who's going to be the week one nickel quarterback since Collins is suspended. It's going to be questions of whether Collins is going to immediately get that job back once he comes off the suspension, and that's going to depend on how well he plays between now and week one, and that's going to depend on how whoever his replacement is plays those first 4 weeks. It could be a situation where we're desperate to have Jalen Collins come back and fill that spot because whoever replaces him is bad. Or it could be a situation where we're like, hey, that guy's pretty good. Why should we just give the job back to Jalen Collins? I think safety is a little bit more solidified. I think Ishmael and Tharizi, I'd be shocked if either one of those guys don't make the team. I think both of those guys are quality backups. They have shown that in past years where as spot starters they can get by. Long-term starters, I don't necessarily see that for either one of those guys. But to me, the big concern with the secondary is basically depth at cornerback. But other than that, I do think you can say at least when you're looking at the 4 starters, it's certainly I think the strength of our defense right now with Trufant and Alford on the outside. And even though I've been a little bit somewhat hesitant to jump fully on the Ricardo Allen bandwagon as far as him being the long-term free safety, I do think worst case scenario he's an average NFL starter, which I don't necessarily know I can say about every other position group that we're going to have potential starters in the rest of the defense. So, that's basically the same way I sort of feel about Keanu Neal. I don't expect Neal to come in and have a great rookie season. I think he'll have his ups, he'll have his downs, like all rookies typically do, and maybe a case where the downs outweigh the ups, as is typically the case with rookies. But I do think he'll be able to do some positive things and help out our secondary. So I think secondary is probably the strength of our defense right now.
Especially if Keanu Neal ends up being the player that we think he'll be, the secondary could be a huge strength, like Legion of Boom Junior strength.
I think there's a couple more personnel changes that will need to be made before we get to that point, but I do think
you need a rangier free safety, and you're pretty much there.
Yeah, and I'm also of the opinion that we're going to have to make some changes at cornerback next offseason, but we'll see how that goes.
You said something to me one year, which was the Falcons don't have anybody to re-sign or anybody that they're worried about re-signing because they don't have any talent. They don't have any talented players on this team. And then they've got somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million in cap next year. Where's that money supposed to go to, Aaron? Who are the talented players that they need to re-sign? Just list them all. Who's right at the top? Desmond Trufant? He's already signed. He's got a contract. He's got that 5th-year option. If he re-signs, it's going to lower that option.
Yeah.
Who else is on that list?
Are you trying to get me to say Robert Alford?
That's the only person that is on the list is Robert Alford.
Okay.
I mean, Paul Warlow, come on now. You're not giving him a big contract.
Well, first off, Scott, I don't know, I haven't calculated the numbers exactly, but everywhere I see is more like the Falcons going to have like $30, $35 million in cap space next year, not the $50 million. And I do think, can the Falcons afford to keep Robert Alford? As I've said throughout the last year, I think, yes, they can. They have the money to do it. I think it's not a question of can they spend the money. It's not like they have $20 in their pocket, but it's a question of will they actually take the $20 out of their pocket and spend it on this guy? And when you're looking at a contract that's going to pay Trufant somewhere in the range of like 60 to 80 to maybe even $90 million next summer, I don't feel like, and I feel like Alford at a bare minimum is going to be able to demand a contract that is at least 30, 35 million at the minimum. Like, I think it could get up into the 40s and 50s potentially, depending on how well he plays this year. I just don't see the Falcons are like, oh yeah, we're going to have $150 million invested in our cornerbacks this year. It just doesn't make a lot of sense from a financial standpoint, especially when very few teams. I don't know. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think they're going to do it, but we'll find out next year, I guess.
Why I say they have $50 million. The Falcons have essentially $8K in cap space right now. $9K or $9 million, I should say, in cap space right now. They've got a Tyson Jackson contract that's not going to be there next year. That's $4.25 million. They've got a Brooks Reed contract that I don't see there next year at $4.1 million. So that's about $8.35 million plus the 34 that's projected plus assumed $6 million in carryover. It's roughly 48, 49 million. And that's basing it off of a salary cap increase of going up to 170 when it's at 155 right now, of the same 10% that's been going up every single year for the past 3 years. That's where my math's coming from.
Okay. I don't want to doubt your math or anything like that. I was looking it up the other day and checking out like over the cap and Spotrac, and it looked like there was more like 30, 35. But look, I'm not gonna I'm not going to second guess you. If you have faith in your math, and I have faith in your math. Okay, next question is from the Colorado Falcon. He says, "What would you think of us bringing in Chris Culliver if he can pass a medical exam?"
No, just no. He's mediocre. He can't play in the slot. He's average at best on the outside. I don't like him as a player.
Okay. I like Chris Culliver a little bit better than you. I have my issues with Chris Culliver, but at this point, as they always say, beggars can't be choosers. And I think if I have the options of having Chris Culliver play outside and nickel versus whoever else the Falcons have right now, or pretty much anybody not named Robert Alford or Desmond Trufant, I would take Chris Culliver in a heartbeat over any of those guys. But I think, obviously I think he does have the injury issues. He hasn't really been healthy. He's had a couple of off-field run-ins, I guess, over the last 4 or 5 years. So, he has his issues. So if we signed him in this hypothetical world, I wouldn't exactly sit, not lose any sleep over it, because you might find out that he might not be able to contribute that much. But I feel a lot better with Chris Culliver than some of these other guys. But okay. Andrew Hathaway says, "Do you think Godfrey or King will get the majority of the nickel cornerback snaps?"
I think Robert Alford will play the majority of the slot cornerback snaps, and the nickel cornerback will be Jalen Collins. The fifth defensive back will be Jalen Collins.
Okay, so
I think the first 4 games you'll see King, because I think Godfrey blows. I think you'll see King, and then in the dime you might see Godfrey, or you might see Ishmael, depending on what they want to play in.
okay, all right. No, I don't think either of these guys will get the. I guess to answer the question, Andrew, probably King will get the majority until the time he doesn't get the majority, because this situation sort of reminds me of the 2011 Falcons, when going into that training camp, they had an obvious hole at safety behind starters Willie Moe and Thomas Deku, and they were sitting there acting like Raphael Bush and Sean Schillinger were ready to be a third safety in the NFL, and they weren't. And they wound up signing James Sanders. I feel like the cornerback situation is the exact same situation, where the Falcons are basically giving guys like King this time during this point in the summer to get all these practice reps working with the nickel team to sort of speed up his development. But I think when push comes to shove, the guy who's going to be the week 1 nickel cornerback is not currently on the roster right now. So I feel like at some point, whether it's later this month, before training camp in July, at the end of August, or at the first week of September, the Falcons are going to make a move at cornerback to solidify that nickel cornerback spot. It might be bringing back Philip Wheeler. If Brandon Boykin is still unsigned, maybe they revisit him. I don't know who it's going to be. I probably put the smart money's probably on. Did I say Philip Wheeler? Philip Adams at this point. But I have zero confidence in either Charles Godfrey or Akeem King filling that spot. Because here's the thing I'll say about Akeem King. Here's my Akeem King take that I alluded to a moment ago. I won't say it's impossible that Akeem King makes the development to become our nickel cornerback by week 1, but I will say, based off of where he was at this point last year, as a guy who really only played like 3 games as a cornerback in college, to being a guy that can go up week 1 and be able to cover Vincent Jackson and you not have to lose any sleep over that, would be the biggest jump in talent development I've ever seen. So to me, it's one of those things where I don't feel like it's really realistic to expect Akeem King to get there. It's just like if you're telling me that he is going to get there, that's basically telling me, okay, well, this is the greatest single-year development that has ever happened for a cornerback in the last 15 years from my own eyes. So I just don't see it as realistic. But I know other people are a little bit more optimistic than I am.
Well, that and they're kind of looking at Ricardo Allen and saying, "Oh, he had the single most insane jump from a football player at free safety last year." But I mean, that's unrealistic to expect. He was probably better off as a free safety than as a corner.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really the same because Ricardo Allen was like 20 times a better college athlete, college football player than King was at San Jose State. And, you know, we kind of knew that Ricardo Allen could play free safety, or at least some of us. You know, I remember writing in my scouting report of him, if he was an inch taller and 10 pounds heavier, he would have been a better free safety prospect than Desmond Southwood was. I said that back in 2014. So it wasn't like a massive leap for him to be able to go from where he was at the end of 2014 to being a league average NFL starter, like it is for me for King, who's basically never really played cornerback before. And then all of a sudden now he's going to be able to cover Vincent Jackson week 1. Like that to me is a massive jump. But hey, what do I know?
No, I'm with you on that. I honestly am hoping that someone else steps up. I thought Sherrod Niesman was a hell of a free safety in college, and he could make a move to a nickel corner. Or Brian Poole out of Florida. I thought he played nickel corner well at Florida, so I don't see why he wouldn't be able to do it in Atlanta, especially since he's a better athlete than what Kevin White was last year. Like a more athletic Kevin White would have made the team last year over some of the guys that did make the team.
Yeah, I agree.
So
okay.
And then we are leaving out the possibility, crazy possibility, but possibility that CJ Goodwin turns it on and ends up being a 6'2", 230-pound or 210-pound, you know, Richard Seymour Part 2 wide receiver to cornerback switch. Listen, if CJ Goodwin can do what Richard Seymour did and be the next Richard Seymour now, that'd be amazing. Because then the Falcons could trade him away and get some ridiculous amount of fucking talent for him. But it's not going to happen. He won't be Richard Seymour. He won't be anything but CJ Goodwin, and he'll probably be like at best, at absolute best, Thorold Simon, who blows.
I was curious if you were going to keep going down that CJ Goodman, Richard Seymour rabbit hole. You pulled back, so I was like, okay, I don't have to say anything. All right.
It's safe to say Thorold Simon blows, right?
Yeah, he's not very good.
I compare what CJ Goodwin to be is probably the next Thorold Simon.
That's fair enough. I think that's fair. Okay. Yeah.
He may make the roster as a gunner where he's okay, and it's like the 5th corner, but past that, I'm not seeing it.
And coincidentally, that Steelers Jaguars game I watched from last summer was probably CJ Goodwin's best preseason game with the Steelers, like because I think he had like a touchdown catch in that game. You know, I'm very curious to see what he does this summer. Like, I'm not going to completely close the door on him shocking us, just because there really is no sort of initial expectations with that. So it's been one of those things where, like, because there's no expectations, he'd come in and be surprisingly good. But yeah, to me, it'd just be a big question mark if we're expecting somebody currently on this roster that's not named Alford or Trufant to be able to cover guys like Vincent Jackson and Kelvin Benjamin and Amari Cooper, which whoever our nickel cornerback is going to be through those first 4 weeks of the season, they're going to draw those assignments. And they're not going to draw them every down, but, you know, there's going to be situations where they're matched up against Mike Evans.
That's why I said I like Sherrod Niesman for the role. Because I feel like he did that in college.
Okay.
It wasn't guys nearly as good.
Okay.
Same kind of body size, same kind of physical receivers. They're putting him in one-on-one in the slot whenever they saw him down the slot. Those Marcus Colston types.
Okay. I mean, at this point, if it was me, if I was stuck with the Falcons secondary, I'd probably put Ricardo Allen in the slot in nickel and just put Threezy on the field. Or Ishmael. Probably be Threezy. Yeah. Whatever. All right. Next question from Ryan Jones. He says, morbid, but outside Matt Ryan and Julio, what is the one player injury that would likely destroy our season?
Outside of Matt Ryan and Julio Jones?
Yeah.
Jake Matthews.
Okay.
I realized, like, there's still some hatred for Jake Matthews among the fan base. God knows why. He played like a top 10 left tackle last year. I know Aaron's going to be like, no, he's in that 13 range, whatever. Like,
I wasn't going to go there. I thought whatever. It, but I wasn't going to say it.
I'm putting him into the top 10 because I'm saying he's in that like 9 to 11 range.
It's fine.
All right.
I'll let it slide this time.
when you're at that range, it's tough to lose that kind of guy. I like Ryan Schrader. I think Schrader could be a Will Svitek level left tackle circa 2011, where Svitek was average for the year, but the whole line played well, so it wasn't a big deal. But without Jake Matthews, that whole line would fall apart because no one else can play left tackle as well as he can on this roster. And when you don't have a good, solid right tackle, I don't trust Lawrence Gibson, Bryce Harris, Tom Compton, anybody on this roster to protect that left side outside of Jake Matthews. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at it from the other side, who's going to play on the right side? Bryce Harris, Tom Compton, Lawrence Gibson. Again, that's scary too, because then you have a sight side and you basically just eliminated the tight end from the offense because you're going to have to put a right tackle and a tight end there to make sure that you've got a decent pass blocker because Compton, Harris, and Gibson all blow. So I think if you lose Jake Matthews, that'd be detrimental to the team. The other guy that I would say is on defense, Desmond Trufant. If you lose him for the season, that defense would go to shit. You're probably looking at a defense that would go from, I'd say it's average. It was average last year. It's probably going to be average again this year. It's going to go from average back down to 28 to 32. Just because you don't have the depth behind Trufant. Who's going to start? Jalen Collins, Kamal Ishmael, DeMarcus Van Dyke, like Akeem King. You're not going to start Akeem King. You're not going to start CJ Goodwin at left cornerback if Desmond Trufant goes out. That injury would be detrimental to the defense. So those are the two guys that if the Falcons lost Julio or Matt Ryan, outside of those guys, if those guys were healthy, it would be detrimental to the team, are Jake Matthews and Desmond Trufant.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to go with either one of the cornerbacks, basically. If we're talking, destroy our season, I think it's the cornerbacks I'd go with over either of the tackles. I think losing one of those two guys, Matthews or Schrader, would certainly hurt the offense quite a bit, but I don't think it would necessarily destroy the offense in the same caliber of losing a Matt Ryan or a Julio Jones or Trufant would. Just like we just talked about, I think our cornerback depth is, at this point, pretty despicable. That's the best word I can come up with. And if you lose either Alford or Trufant, basically you're hoping at that point Collins or a quarterback to be named later is going to be able to step up and be a full-time starter at that point. Obviously, if you had to choose between one of those two guys, Alford or Trufant, then Trufant is the one who's more detrimental of a loss just because he's the better player. But I think either way, if you had Trufant starting every game, and then you had whoever playing right cornerback instead of Alford, and that guy was struggling, like Collins did last year. If like say scenario where Collins isn't improved this year, he's forced to start 14 or 15 games. He's going to get beaten by a drum. And we've played some really good wide receivers this year. We're going to be facing guys like Jordy Nelson and Kelvin Benjamin and Demaryius Thomas and Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, et cetera, et cetera. So it is going to be a situation where if you have a hole at that cornerback spot, if you have a guy who you don't trust can hold up and not get roasted every week, that's going to be a huge, huge issue for this defense, particularly if the Falcons don't have shadow Trufant around the league, because it's basically like, if Trufant's not on Jordy Nelson, it's going to Jordy Nelson every single play with when we play the Packers or a team like that. So I think that would be a very devastating injury if we lost either of our starting quarterbacks. All right. Now we are to, I think, the last question. Let me check. Yeah, looks like it. Short show, guys. It is June. Charlie Rogers 68 asks, chances Hester is on the opening day roster? Looks like he may be done here.
All depends on how they feel about Eric Weems and Tevin Coleman and Devin Fuller and all these guys that are returning kicks and punts, and how they feel like how they're going to do compared to Devin Hester, and whether keeping Hester on the roster would be worth it. Also depends on whether Hester's healthy. Right now, I'd say it's 50-50. If he's healthy, he's on the roster. If he's not healthy, he gone.
Okay, yeah, I can't disagree with that. I think the Falcons basically are – I would say the chances he's on the opening day roster are probably like 30%, 25%. I think the Falcons are looking for a reason to cut him, basically. I think with Fuller into the mix, I think having Weems, even though I don't think Weems is going to make the team, Nick Williams, giving guys like Coleman some looks at kickoff returner. You got a couple of other guys that are some camp bodies that might be able to emerge as a surprise return specialist. Basically, I think the Falcons are, if they think any of their other guys are good enough to handle the spot, then I think they're going to cut Hester.
I mean, when you look at it and you see all the guys that they've got at receiver, Devin Hester, honestly, is probably the 5th or even 6th best receiver on this roster. I'd say Julio Jones, easily. Mohamed Sanu, easily. Justin Hardy, easily. Nick Williams are all easily better at wide receiver than Devin Hester is. Because Devin Hester as a wide receiver kind of sucks. If we're being 100% honest here.
Okay, I mean, I'd probably put him at like 5. I think he's still probably better than Nick Williams, but hey, no, Nick Williams is therapy.
When you're arguing against Nick Williams versus Devin Hester, that's your issue.
Your point is still valid, but yeah, I'm nitpicking. So continue. I'm sorry.
Nick Williams at $600,000 for comparable talent at wide receiver to Eric Weems and Devin Hester for $1.4 and $3 million. I know what I'm gonna pay for. Personally, I'm going to take the budget guy. I'm going to take Nick Williams and say, you know what? Let me save this $4 million and spend it on shit that actually matters, like Dwight Freeney.
For the record, I would like to say before anybody gets it twisted, I am a big fan of Devin Hester. If it was up to me, I'd keep him on the roster regardless of how much he's going to get paid this year. But I do think the writing is on the wall, at least from the Falcons standpoint. I think if he makes the team, it's going to be because, A, nobody else stepped up and looked like a viable kick returner at any point in the training camp, or B, Hester just came out and just tore it up and, took like 3 punts back in preseason or something like that, which, with Devin Hester is possible. But,
yes.
It's one of those things where, like, unless Hester is just absolutely just dominant at age, like 34, 33, whatever he is, or, Devin Fuller, the one concern I have right now that makes me a little less optimistic than I would have been a week ago if I was asked this question is Devin Fuller has a hamstring issue. And hamstrings are notoriously lingering issues. So I am slightly concerned at this point. Maybe there's a chance that Fuller is not able to shake that hamstring by the time we get to training camp. He'll have time to heal and whatnot, but hamstrings are notoriously injuries that you sort of can easily re-aggravate at any given point. So that would be a concern for me if he's being sidelined during training camp and preseason games because he's got a nagging hamstring injury. That's going to be the best case scenario for Hester to stick because I think the Falcons are really looking at Fuller to take his job more so than anybody else. It's basically, I think it's Devin Fuller's job to lose this summer as far as the kickoff punt return specialist guy. So, I think the odds are against Devin Hester, but I won't completely say there's no chance or anything like that. Okay. All right, guys. We got this done in under an hour. So congratulations to us. You can subscribe to this show on YouTube to get regular updates. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes as well. Rate and review us there. Leave a comment on YouTube. Be sure to, if you want to get a mailbag question in for our next show, I won't say next week because I doubt we'll have anything to really talk about next week, but we'll at least give you a show, if not next week, then the week after. If you guys want to send in questions, then you can use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. You can tweet at the show at Falcons PFC. I am, of course, on Twitter at FalcFans. Scott is at Karasik S. Check out all the shows on ProFootballCentral.com. A lot of other shows if you care about what's going on with the Lions right now. They got a lot of great content over at their podcast. So, I should also plug my Wes Schweitzer and Devin Fuller scouting reports should be up on FalcFans.com by the end of the week. Scott, do you have anything that you need to plug? I know you wrote something recently for Sportsnot.
I wrote an article on it's called the Kerr collar. It's an invention that's based around creating a head and neck system, I guess you could say, where the helmet and the shoulder pads interact. Because a lot of the concussions, from what Dr. Kerr has been finding, is it's because the neck is compressing and the spinal cord's basically staying rigid, and then the neck compresses and then the brain's sloshing around. Where if you transport the collision from the helmet to the shoulder pads, you might end up with maybe 2 or 3 more broken collarbones in this season. But I feel like if there was a 50% decrease in concussions, and 3 people broke a collarbone because of a super hard hit, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. I don't think anybody out there would worry about that whole situation if that's what happened. So that's basically been his goal, and have it to where the helmet hits this pad called the Kerr collar, and then it transports everything into the shoulder pads, and then you're using your shoulders, which are some of the strongest bones in your body, to absorb the impact.
Okay. All right, guys, that's our show this week. So, be sure to subscribe, rate us, do all that stuff I just talked about, and check out our stuff at FalcFans and Sportsnot.com.